Good afternoon, everybody. How is everyone doing today on this Wednesday? I just wanted to wish you all a happy Mardi Gras a little early. Hopefully you saw my slide and realized that we were going to be talking about food and festivities down from Cajun country. Anyway, I am Karen Wilder. I'm the dietitian here at Cedarfield. I'm also a New Orleans native, sort of. I'm actually from a town called Houma, Louisiana, which is, believe it or not, 60 miles southwest of New Orleans. So I am truly down from the swamps and the bayous and the alligators and all of that fun stuff. So it is not technically Mardi Gras today, but if you were down in New Orleans, in that area where I'm from, you would be in the throes of Mardi Gras season right now. It truly is a season, not just a day, kind of like we celebrate Christmas, for what seems like 3 months now. Mardi Gras is much the same way, especially depending on when it falls. Sometimes it's based off of the lunar calendar, and it can be different times of the year every year. So if it's later in the year, then Mardi Gras season goes on and on and on, as opposed to if it's a little earlier in the season. Anyway, so so Mardi Gras is on March 1st this year, if I'm not mistaken, which I will not be doing another show before then, so I thought I'd make today our Mardi Gras show. This was kind of a long time coming, since I am from the South and wanted to talk about some good Cajun food. Alrighty, so let's jump right in. I did not wear any Mardi Gras attire today. I thought about it, but it didn't quite happen. So pretend like I am adorned in purple, green, and gold, and we'll talk about the meaning of those colors a little later. So when you think of New Orleans and Cajun food and Mardi Gras, you probably don't think about nutrition and anything healthy, and that is a fair assumption. The food in South Louisiana is, in my opinion, but I would feel like a lot of people would probably make the same argument, some of the best you'll ever have anywhere in the world. It's unbelievable down there. I absolutely love going home, and all I want to do when I go home is just eat. Let's go to this restaurant, this restaurant, this restaurant, this restaurant, and get all the good stuff. I probably gain 10 pounds every time I go home, and I just love it. It's delicious, and it's nice that it's become popular, and I can actually get some good Cajun recipes here in Richmond if I do some digging. I have actually met quite a few people from New Orleans and South Louisiana here in Richmond, so we're here, we're representing. But anyway, the food is not particularly healthy. It's very rich and decadent and just loaded in sodium. You come away looking kind of like the Michelin Man, ankles nice and swollen. So if you have hypertension, high blood pressure, I would challenge you to stay away. But it is delicious, and sometimes it might be worth a little bit of the negative consequences to your heart and your arteries for that good Cajun food. So let's jump into kind of the distinction. Cajun and Creole are terms that are kind of used interchangeably nowadays, and rightfully so. But there is a distinction, and if you were in South Louisiana, people are a little more adamant about making that distinction. So let's talk about the differences between the two. So Cajun, okay, so there's one hard and fast rule. If you just need one thing to differentiate between Cajun and Creole, it's tomatoes. So Cajun food does not use tomatoes, Creole food does use tomatoes. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit. But the real difference between the two types of food are really behind the people and kind of the origins of those people and where they came from, etc. Again, over time, these origins go back to the 17 and 1800s. And nowadays, again, we're all kind of mixed in down south, so there aren't as many distinctions, but here's the history. So Cajun food is considered more like peasant food or country food. So the word Cajun is derived from the Acadians, who were people who lived kind of in the area like known as Acadia, or the Nova Scotia area up in Canada. So these were French settlers that landed there, and then later on in the 1700s with the British conquest, they were exiled out, and so they kind of traveled down the Mississippi River until they couldn't go anymore, and that's where they settled, which is now South, the area known as kind of South Louisiana, which is kind of cut off, if you know, Louisiana is a boot, so kind of where the turn goes, if you kind of create a line there, that's kind of the distinction between South Louisiana, where the true Cajuns are. Northern Louisiana is more just kind of country, kind of similar to more like what you think of Mississippi and Arkansas that border those areas, or even Texas. So we're talking about, the bottom of the boot. Anyway, so as these people kind of made their way down, they were, they were poor, they were exiled out of their lands, they were carrying what few possessions they had on their backs, and they were very resourceful people. They were just kind of living off the land. So when they settled in Louisiana, they were there to just incorporate some of the, the cultures and traditions of their people, but they had to kind of adapt to what was available to them. So they made use of the wild game that's very prevalent in South Louisiana, also the seafood from the Gulf of Mexico, and a lot of the plants and things that grew around there, things that they were accustomed to using. Obviously, back in those days, they didn't have refrigeration, so they were very good at using all parts of the animals when they were slaughtered. So that's how a lot of these sausages that were, that are kind of prevalent in South Louisiana, like boudin and andouille sausage, that comes from that notion of just using up as much of the slaughtered animals as they could. So one thing that is kind of universal among cooking in South Louisiana, whether it's Cajun or Creole, is the first rule of cooking is first you make a roux. There's even cookbooks called First You Make a Roux, kind of taken from that tradition of that's like pretty much the staple first part of any recipe down there. So you make a roux. So what that is just heating flour and some type of oil or fat, which creates that rich sauce type, thick sauce, which is browned and has a buttery, nutty flavor that really, contributes to the overall flavor of the recipe. And then depending on kind of the flavor you're going for or the recipe you're making, you can brown it for a short amount of time and have a blonde roux, or you can have brown it for a longer time and have a darker, rich roux. So typically the Cajun people, again, these people were more of just the simple folk. They didn't have a lot of resources. So they would have a tendency to make their roux with oil and flour. And then after making the roux, the next part to any good Cajun or Creole recipe is incorporating what is known as the Holy Trinity. And so this is onions and celery and bell peppers. So those are chopped finely and then sauteed or simmered in the roux, and then everything else is added in. So typically recipes are gonna have, these vegetables because they're pretty prevalent, and then, they use a lot of garlic, and then lots of, good spices and herbs. And then of course the cayenne pepper, which makes the food nice and spicy, which it's very known for. So also really popular in Cajun recipes, not so much in Creole, is the use of filet, which is ground sassafras leaves. So we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about gumbo. All right, so on the flip side, there's the Creole cooking. So the word Creole refers to people who were born and people who were native, were born to the settlers in French colonial New Orleans and other parts of South Louisiana. So these were the people, these French settlers came in. So then the people who were born there after that point were known as the Creoles. So this was actually a term of distinction. I think nowadays people tend to think of it more in relation to Haitians and things like that, but truly that word comes it's derived from, I can't remember what the origin of the word is, but whatever that word is, it means native or local. So then once the Spanish came in, then it also referred to the Spanish people who were born there, or born to the Spanish settlers. But then it also began to be referred to, it was referred to the African and the Haitian people that were there, the slaves, but also some of the free people of color. So it really just kind of, as time went on, it just kind of started being a term for people who were just born of, the people who were living there, the natives and the locals. So now it's just kind of a hodgepodge of all kinds of things. But going back to those original origins, it's kind of a redundancy there. Like I said, this was a term of distinction, a kind of a class distinction. So Creole food, referring to those people, Creole food is more of what's considered aristocratic food. So it's going to be more exotic recipes. And, the origins of these recipes are the same, and a lot of the people cooking them, the slaves, etc., all are coming from the same places, but they had more resources available to them. So they had things like tomatoes, and they had butter, and they had all of this fancy fruits and vegetables that could be imported and brought into the city that the Cajun people out in the country didn't have access to. So these recipes have way more ingredients. They're much more complex, rich, decadent, lots of extra herbs and spices, and then of course the spicy cayenne pepper that we're used to. So again, they would make their roux using butter and flour as opposed to the Cajuns using oil. And they also had access to tomatoes, so they incorporate tomatoes often into their food. So there goes that distinction between the two. Again, now it's all kind of gotten mixed up, and you get a hodgepodge of things, especially when you move away from Louisiana. People aren't quite as in the know. If you're in Louisiana, it might be a little more distinct, and you might actually offend some people here and there, especially when it comes to gumbo. So gumbo is kind of that quintessential Cajun or Creole recipe, right? I think most of us have probably had gumbo. You've heard of it. There are a billion different varieties of gumbo. And the true original gumbo recipe it's hard to find. There's a lot of different origins, but basically, what a common phrase in Louisiana is, the best recipe for gumbo is your mama's recipe. So that's always kind of a hard and fast rule. But again, gumbo it's basically just like a stew, kind of incorporating all of the things we talked about earlier. So you make your roux, and if you're Cajun, it's oil and flour. If you're Creole, it's butter and flour. And then you add the Holy Trinity, and then whatever other vegetables and things you want to use. But again, if you're Creole, you're going to use tomatoes and okra. And if you're Cajun, you will not use okra or tomatoes. You'll use filet. And then, and so the filet and the gumbo, or the okra, are both used as thickeners to kind of thicken up the stew so it's not quite so brothy. So okra is, we all know okra is a vegetable that was brought over from West Africa, and okra or gumbo is actually derived from the Angolan word for the vegetable okra. So that's kind of what a lot of people believe is the origin of the name gumbo for the food. So typically you might have chicken or sausage in gumbo, or seafood. It's usually one or the other. It's either chicken and sausage or seafood. It's very rare that you'd mix the two. Anyway, so that's gumbo. So a little fun fact about gumbo that I have to kind of give this shout out to my hometown. We had a United States Senator named Alan Ellender. I was thinking of Timothy Ellender. His name was Alan Ellender. He was a very popular senator, and he is from my hometown of Houma, Louisiana. I actually grew up with his son Patrick, and we went to school from kindergarten through high school together. Anyway, he was a very popular senator, and he would make gumbo for a lot of his colleagues in DC. So before this time, gumbo wasn't as prevalent around the country as it is now. It wasn't as well known before maybe the 1970s. It was more just popular in the South. And Allen Ellender was making this dish for his colleagues inside the Beltway, and it became really popular in DC, well, amongst the people he worked with, particularly in the Senate. And he died in 1972, and when he died, the Senate directed that gumbo would be put on the menu in the cafeteria in the Senate building as a way to honor him. So now it's this kind of lasting tradition that gumbo is there, and it became a lot more popular after that, especially then in the 80s when Chef Paul Prudhomme became a well-known cooking personality, and he made it really popular. All right, so that's kind of a little bit about gumbo, but then you also may have heard of etouffee and also jambalaya. So these are kind of variations of gumbo. Again, they start with the roux and the Holy Trinity, and you build upon that. So etouffee is more of just, it's more like a creamy sauce. It's kind of like gumbo, but just creamier, and then it's spread over rice. Gumbo is also served over rice. Some people serve it with cornbread, some people serve it with potato salad, just depends. But etouffee is also served over rice, but it looks a little bit more like if you served a pasta dish with like a creamy sauce, as opposed to gumbo, which is more like a stew, and you would eat it with a spoon in a bowl. So the word etouffee literally means smothered, so you can think of the rice as being smothered with this rich, creamy etouffee. And then jambalaya is basically kind of the same thing, but just served as a rice dish. It's pretty popular. Most people have had it. And you can mix in either just vegetables, or you can mix in seafood, or chicken and sausage and things like that. Alrighty, so let's move on to Mardi Gras and some of the foods associated with Mardi Gras. Well, there's one in particular we're going to talk about. So again, you don't necessarily think of health and food and nutrition when you think of Mardi Gras, rightfully so. There's not a whole lot of healthy behaviors going on during Mardi Gras. But that's okay, that's the point, and we'll go into the history. So for those of you who don't know, Mardi Gras goes way back into the pagan, the history and the roots of Mardi Gras. It goes way back to pagan culture when they were having these big celebrations this time of the year, honoring spring, like the upcoming spring, and also fertility as things are being reborn this time of the year, and especially in the Roman Empire and those areas, Rome and Greece. So if you were going to New Orleans and you were going to some of the parades, you'd notice that a lot of the names of the crews putting on the parades have Greek and Roman gods, as their name. Like there's the crew of Endymion and the crew of Aphrodite and things like that. So that's kind of, hearkening back to the roots from the days in Rome, etc. And then, of course, when Christianity came into play in the Roman Empire, like so many other traditions with Christmas and etc., and rather than just abolishing these festivities altogether, they kind of incorporated them into the Christian tradition so that they could appease the people and allow them to still have their festivities, but also, they could be celebrating Christianity with their festivals. So basically they kind of turned Mardi Gras into a grand kind of just blowing it out before the beginning of Lent, which is a time of, a somber time of fasting and atonement, etc., and kind of, introversion. So, revelers would eat up all of their meat, their decadent foods, like their meats and their cheese and their eggs and milk and lard, things like that, because Lent is a time of fasting, so the recipes and cooking would become a lot more simpler, and they were eating a lot of fish and things like that. So the word carnival, which is associated with Mardi Gras, if you think of the root carne or carne, From Latin, there's a Latin word, carnellivarium, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, actually means take away or remove the meat. So it kind of plays into this whole notion of getting rid of all of the decadence, blowing it out, getting everything out of your system, so to speak, before the beginning of Lent. So Mardi Gras is the day before Ash Wednesday, which is the first day of Lent. So Mardi Gras means Fat Tuesday. So if you've been feasting for, all of the days leading up to Mardi Gras Day, you might become fat and rich and all of the things like that. All right, so obviously you're probably familiar with the notion of carnival. So Mardi Gras obviously is very huge in New Orleans, but carnival is also celebrated a lot of places where there's a really rich Roman Catholic tradition. So places like Brazil and Venice, Quebec City also has a big celebration, and then even places like Germany and Denmark, you find some variations of the carnival celebration. All right, and so the traditional Mardi Gras colors are purple, green, and gold. So in 1872, I think, if I remember correctly from my research, there was a Russian Grand Duke Alexis visiting New Orleans, and when the parades came, they started, that was kind of around the time the tradition of throwing trinkets and beads off of the floats to the revelers in the street started, and the beads were, they decided to make them purple, green, and gold after the colors from this Grand Duke's royal house. So those three colors were the traditional colors of his house: purple, green, and gold. So purple stands for justice, green stands for faith, and gold stands for power. And so those kind of have carried on through the years today. And those are kind of the colors of New Orleans now. When you think of New Orleans, you're probably going to see purple, green, and gold. All right, so what about the king cake? So this is, during Mardi Gras season, you're just celebrating. There isn't really anything specific to Mardi Gras that we eat. It's just, you just eat everything. And you eat a lot of these traditional Cajun and Creole recipes that we're talking about. But the king cake is kind of the one thing that's unique to the Mardi Gras season. So the history of the king cake, and you've probably seen them. I know they sell them around here in some of the grocery stores. It's basically it's not a cake like we think of. It's like an oval. It's more like a pastry, but it's in the shape of an oval usually, and could be kind of like a donut or a pastry, and then it'll have some icing on top, and then it's usually decorated in purple, green, and gold. And some are plain, but then some have some sort of a filling like cinnamon or pralines or maybe some fruit and cream cheese. And then you also might find a little plastic baby tucked into the cake somewhere, and you might be the lucky person to find it. So why on earth is there a naked plastic baby in the cake? So the king cake goes back to the tradition of celebrating the Epiphany. So if you think about the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, right? There's Christmas Day. 12 days later is the Epiphany, or King's Day. And that is the day that is kind of, the tradition holds that the three wise men, or the three kings, visited baby Jesus and brought him gifts. And so that is the official last day of Christmas. Well, in Louisiana, that is the official first day of Mardi Gras. So we call it the 12th night. So it's the Epiphany, and then it's kind of like the day, and then the 12th night, there's a lot of big parties to celebrate the opening, the end of Christmas and the beginning of Mardi Gras season. So then, the season is celebrated from that day on up to Fat Tuesday. So the Epiphany, there are traditions where, in celebrating the Epiphany, people would bring gifts or treats to children, kind of to represent the notion of giving gifts to baby Jesus. And so, a cake being one of them. And since it was King's Night, or, we were celebrating the three kings bringing the gifts to Jesus, the cake became known as the king cake. So it kind of has this whole root in Christianity, believe it or not. So the little plastic baby that's in the cake represents Jesus in that regard. And putting the baby in the cake started around in the 1940s. I think there was a local bakery that started doing that, and then it caught on. So now, you can't have a king cake without a baby in it. And the tradition is basically, people think, oh, getting the baby is good luck or whatever. But basically what it means, if you get the baby, then it's your job to either host the next king cake party or at least buy the next king cake for, whatever gathering you go to next. I mean, that's kind of loosely followed these days. It's just kind of fun to get the baby in the cake. It's kind of strange, but anyway, so there's some interesting history behind Mardi Gras and the foods we eat there. But I'd be remiss not to mention a few other favorites in South Louisiana. Let me see if we have time. We have a few minutes. All right. So red beans and rice is another really popular dish in South Louisiana. And if you have ever gone to a restaurant and they have red beans and rice as a special, it was probably on a Monday, and Monday is red beans and rice day. In Louisiana and South Louisiana, any restaurant you go to is going to have red beans and rice on Monday. If they're going to have it, it's going to be on Monday. And here's the reason why. So back in the day of, when the slaves or whoever were taking care of, the rich folks back in those days, traditionally ham was served on Sundays as kind of a grand feast after church, and then the ham bone was saved, and because it could be used in a stock for flavoring, etc. So on Mondays were also laundry day, and laundry, was a pretty tedious task, especially back in the days when we didn't have washers and dryers. You were out in the yard scrubbing in the big wash tub, which took a lot of time, and there wasn't a lot of time for cooking. So red beans and rice became a really popular dish to prepare on Mondays because you could put the beans in the pot to soak and simmer, and then you didn't really have to do much after that. You could put the ham bone from Sunday in there to flavor it, and then you could just kind of leave it alone and go tend to the laundry. So that is why red beans and rice are traditionally served, especially at dinner time, on Mondays. Alrighty, and so finally, if you've ever been to New Orleans, you have more than likely gone to the French Quarter, and if you've been to the French Quarter, you probably went to Café du Monde, right there in the French Market, which is not really there anymore, very sadly. The building structure is still there, but the market is gone. And you probably had Café Au Lait and beignets there in kind of the open air little coffee stand. So they're delicious. Beignets are derived from the Acadians who came down from French. It's just kind of a variation on the traditional French pastry. There's really nothing special about them, but they're just very traditional to New Orleans. They're just the little square donuts with powdered sugar on top, and they're delicious, and you will be covered from head to toe in powdered sugar by the time you finish enjoying them, and it's completely worth it. And then finally, you probably had Café Au Lait with your beignets. So this is something that's pretty unique to New Orleans, where coffee was made with scalded milk as opposed to steamed milk or cold milk. And then also the coffee itself, it has what's called chicory incorporated in it. And so chicory is an herb that grows, and the root of this herb is the chicory root is what it's called, and that is another tradition from the French settlers, the Acadians who came down. This was something that they did. It created a bold but kind of bitter flavor. That's why it's easily paired with the sweet beignets. But then during the Civil War, it really became prevalent when the Union naval ships blocked the port of New Orleans. there wasn't as much coffee. There was kind of a coffee shortage. So that chicory kind of serves as an extender. So they could kind of add it to the coffee to, to keep their coffee supplies more abundant than, they would if they were just using the straight coffee. So then, so the French settlers or, the French people kind of, gave this idea to the people there and especially to the soldiers, to have their coffee. That was kind of a thing that they were already doing, and they, provided that tip, and that is kind of how the tradition of incorporating chicory into the coffee in New Orleans became so popular. And it just gives it that kind of bold, strong, wake you up in the morning flavor. That's pretty good if you like that kind of thing, which I do. Alrighty, so hopefully if you have not been to New Orleans, you have started planning your trip, because I guarantee you, you will eat well and you will enjoy a wonderful and beautiful city full of great architecture. I can't say enough about what a great city and area South Louisiana is. Go on a swamp tour, see the alligators, have some good gumbo, have some beignets and cafe au lait, and have a great time. So I will be off for a few weeks because we have residence council next week, and then the next week is Ash Wednesday. So I think I'm gonna kind of, out of solidarity for the solemnity of Ash Wednesday, I may skip my talk, and then I'll be back the next week. So I hope all of you have a great couple of weeks, and I will see you in March. Happy Mardi Gras!